was associated almost exclusively with the economic growth. At present, there is a tendency to view development in a broader term containing economic, social, and environmental elements. Also, human beings are increasingly at the center of development efforts, particularly with regard to resource management and participation. The political and socio-economic progress which underpins development is fundamental for the realization of all human rights. For example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognizes the right of everyone to education. This is coupled with the obligation by the state to actively pursue the development of a system of schools at all levels. This is perfectly reasonable, because how can individuals properly receive the education to which they are entitled without schools or universities? Another example is offered by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The ICCPR guarantees to all persons the right for a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal established by law. In order for an individual to actually benefit from the right to a fair trial, there has to be a functioning judicial system that respects the rule of law and operates independently and free from corruption. The current international development efforts gravitate around the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in 2009 by the United Nations General Assembly. Indeed, significant progress has been made around the world in achieving these goals. The United Nations Development Programme has reported noticeable reductions in global poverty and improvements in enrollment and gender parity in schools. Progress has been made in reducing both child and maternal mortality. Treatments for HIV/AIDS have increased, and steps are being taken to ensure environmental sustainability. While we are meeting here today, a second World Summit is taking place in New York to evaluate the implementation of the goals vis-à-vis their 2015 deadline. Some have criticized the Millennium Development Goals. They have argued that these are incompatible with international human rights law because they do not impose high enough standards for states when compared with international human rights treaties. It has also been argued that development efforts can be manipulated by states and donors to distract attention from more pressing human rights issues. These criticisms are valid, however, they should not be overstated. It is true that international human rights law grants rights to all human beings without distinction. In contrast, the Millennium Development Goals seek to improve the living conditions of portions of the human population. For example, the first Millennium Development Goal seeks to reduce by 50% the total number of extremely poor people by 2015. Yet, even if this is reached, the other half of the world's poor will be living with less than $1 per day. But this misses the point. The Millennium Development Goals are not ends in themselves. Rather, they should be seen as important tools towards attaining some key objectives set by the international human rights law. Several of the indicators used to measure the targets implementing the goals relate to numerous economic and social rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living, to work, to food, to education, to health, to water, and to housing. Also, some targets are directly linked to the human rights of women and children and the fundamental principles of equality and non-discrimination. The implementation of the Millennium Development Goals in a manner that is consistent with human rights law amounts to nothing less than planting the seeds for human development. As countries become more developed economically, socially, and politically, they also become more apt to respect, protect, and fulfill the fundamental human rights of all people under their jurisdiction. No longer can they invoke their underdevelopment as an excuse for not respecting international human rights law. This brings me to the notion of human development and its relationship with human rights. Human rights are inherent to all human beings without distinction. In contrast, the degree of human development in a given country is a factual reality that fluctuates. It is linked to such factors as the absence of child mortality, high education rates, and low gender inequalities. Even though human rights, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights, and human development are closely linked, they are not synonymous. A country may have a relative high human development ranking, but this does not mean that its domestic human rights situation is necessarily good. Let me give you an example from the Arab region. According to the 2009 Arab Human Development Report, 7 states were listed with high human development scores. Almost all remaining states were in the medium category of human development. Despite these relatively good results, the report highlighted the lack of political will in these states to foster real change toward the full realization of human rights. It stressed the need for Arab systems of governance to abandon the status quo by reducing the powers of small elite groups, reinforcing the rule of law, strengthening the powers of legislature, and increasing the independence of the judiciary. This would require important changes in attitudes and mindsets. The existing cultures of corruption and privileges would have to be abandoned. A move would have to be made towards accountability, the rule of law, and participation at the grassroots level. It is only by fostering a climate of responsibility and transparency the Arab states can truly identify the areas which hinder human development throughout their societies. On the one hand, a domestic order which favors social justice, poverty reduction, and the adequate redistribution of wealth is consistent with international policy as well as the Islamic values of unity, brotherhood, solidarity, justice, and peace. On the other hand, the current scenario in which wealth and power are monopolized and where nepotism, fraud, and extravagant, non-productive spending are rampant go against international policy and values of Islam as well. Obviously, much remains to be done in order for the Millennium Development Goals to be achieved. If these goals are to amount to more than just targets and checklists, if they are to have a lasting impact, they must be implemented consistently with international human rights standards. This will favor the human development of millions of people around the world, particularly the most vulnerable members of society. But the Millennium Development Goals are only transitory and are set to expire in 2015. In some respects, the General Assembly is looking past this date. Last December, it adopted a resolution expressing the desire to have the right to development defined and placed on the same level as other human rights. It is too early to say whether the right to development will become a binding human right that can be used as a mechanism for advancing overall human development, because most Western and developed states did not support that resolution. Yet, the discussions surrounding the definition of the right to development will at the very least get more and more people thinking about the long-term implementation of this right. In doing so, we increase the chances that development in general and human development in particular will continue to progress in a manner that is consistent with human rights development. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khul, for your interesting talk and also for the support that you have given this conference and for the support that you have given to the HDCA. This conference would not have been possible, as has already been said, without the commitment and support of the University of Jordan. And for that, and with gratitude, I would like to introduce the University of Jordan President, Dr. Adel.
Your Excellency, Professor Adnan Duran, Excellencies, esteemed dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the University of Jordan, the venue for the 2010 annual conference of the Human Development and Capability Association that is being held under the patronage of Her Majesty Queen Rani Al-Abdullah. Hosting this conference at the University of Jordan emphasizes Jordan's role and efforts in advancing human rights and human development under the leadership of His Majesty King Abdullah II. And it as well recognizes the HDCA intellectual and academic global contributions. Hosting this conference could not have been also possible without His Majesty's continuous efforts and support to human rights and human development issues. In fact, it was Her Majesty's initiative that led to the establishment of the Master's Program in Human Rights and Human Development at the University. The program has become a magnet for students and scholars from around the globe, and its staff's activities and initiatives have made it possible for us to meet here today. This year's conference theme is integrating human rights and human development, as has been mentioned. And while Her Majesty could not be with us today, she has deputized a man of great stature who is deeply involved with human rights